When the book of Esther is mentioned, what comes to mind for many people is a story of bravery and courage. Although this is a theme that may be at the surface of the book, as one delves deeper into the text, it can be seen that there is much more to the story of Esther than her bravery, although it is admirable and should be acknowledged. When people look at the cultural context and certain decisions in the telling of the story, it can be seen that this book's purpose is to reveal God's faithfulness to his people, even when it seems as though he is not present. To understand the message of this book, we will first look at the rhetorical purpose. Throughout the book of Esther, God is not mentioned even once. This may be seen as strange because it is a book of the Bible, and one would expect for God to be mentioned at least once in every book. According to a web entry from biblico.com, an outstanding feature of this book is the complete absence of any explicit reference to God, worship, prayer, or sacrifice, and it appears that the author has deliberately refrained from mentioning God or any religious activity as a literary device to heighten the fact that it is God who controls and directs all the seemingly insignificant coincidences that make up the plot and issue and deliverance for the Jews. By purposely choosing not to mention God, the author is putting an emphasis on the fact that God is sovereign over all things, even when it seems that there is an absence of his presence. According to ESV.org, some of the coincidences in the book of Esther that prove to be God's hand at work are: first, how wonderful that Esther was so beautiful, and that King Xerxes chose her from among all the young women of the kingdom to be his next queen. Second, how fortunate that Mordecai overheard the plot against the king and rescued him from assassination, and that Mordecai's valiant deed of loyalty was recorded in the royal archives. Third, note that when Esther presented herself before the king, which in Persian law was punishable by death, she won favor in his sight and was spared and allowed to speak. And the fact that there were all of these things that just happened to work out for the Jews and lead to their deliverance just further stresses the fact that God has power over all things and he works in miraculous ways. Now that we've covered the rhetorical purpose of this book, we will look at the cultural context. The first thing that we need to understand is the history of the Jews and their exile. According to GraceOnlineLibrary.org, the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon and exiled for about 47 years until Cyrus came into power and allowed them to return back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the temple, but his motives were political and would strengthen his power. According to this website, many Jews decided to stay in captivity because of the relative comfort they felt in Babylon. From this, we can see that even though the Jews were welcomed back, they were not really accepted. In the text, we can also see that the Jews were persecuted because Haman, the king's highest noble, wanted to destroy the Jews after he found out that Mordecai, a man that would not kneel down or pay him honor, was a Jew. Haman was an Agagite, and according to GraceOnlineLibrary.org, this was an association with the Amalekites, which were the first people to attack God's people to destroy them after the Exodus. The fact that a man so high-ranking with the king had such contempt for the Jews is an indication that the odds were against them and things should not have worked out in their favor. Along with this, during that time in the kingdom of Xerxes, people were not allowed to approach the king unless they were summoned by him. In chapter 4, verse 11 of Esther, Esther states, "All the king's officials and the people know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives." Later on in the story, Esther approaches the king without being summoned first, and he not only extends his scepter to her, but also attends a banquet that she sets up for him and submits to her request that she spare the lives of her people. He even goes as far as to kill Haman, which is the man who wanted the king to kill all the Jews in the first place. The fact that things worked out so well for Esther and her people is an indication that even though God was not mentioned in this book, he was at work to protect and deliver his chosen people. From a rhetorical analysis of the author's purpose of the book of Esther and the cultural context, we can see that the meaning behind this book goes beyond just a story of bravery, but rather it's meant to reveal God's sovereignty even when we do not know that he is there working for our good. Thank you.